Hello again. This is a continuation of my last devlog, which I posted about a month ago. If you haven't seen it yet, or if you need a refresher, you'll likely want to give that a watch so you can understand the premise of what I've got going on now. Now that you've done that, if you needed to, or decided not to do that, I'll continue with the devlog. Before I get into my own updates, I have to acknowledge this crazy coincidence that happened following my last video. In my last video, I mentioned how I'm inspired by these games where you're playing in realistic, sometimes household settings, which have been scaled up around you, and you're playing as a character who is very small by comparison. My video released at night on June 20th. Then, unbeknownst to me, until after it happened, Nintendo premiered some announcements the following morning, June 21st. And in their video, they revealed this indoor area for the upcoming Pikmin game, and this bathroom theme course for Mario Kart 8, similar to what they did for the reimagining of Ribbon Road. So it looks to me like I'm on the same wavelength as the big guys. Pretty cool. Alright, let's get into it now. So in these past 3 weeks, I've made most of my progress by modeling some of the objects in my room. I got a lot more familiar with Blender, and I was able to improve my workflow in a few places. Before I recorded my last devlog, I had actually already begun working on a model of my dresser. I kept it all as one mesh and spent a lot of time making this crazy UV layout. In the future, I think it would be fun if you were able to open one of these drawers to use as a platform, but for now the dresser is one mesh and everything is static. I measured the dimensions and positions of all the frames on this wall, and I also modeled and textured my desk, my speakers, this lab snacks box, and my office chair. But I want to put particular focus on the desk and the chair. These objects are distinct from the other models in the room in that they're made up of multiple meshes, which I've grouped into their own respective collections. In simpler terms, for each of these objects there are a few overlapping or adjacent 3D models that make up a larger model. This also means I get to do the texture mapping separately for each part of the model without the geometry of nearby parts affecting my ability to unwrap the pieces. Otherwise, I have to think really hard about marking seams and laying everything out in 2D in a logical way. As I mentioned with the dresser, the UV texture map ended up being crazy. It took me so long to do, and it likely would have been much easier to handle if I had just made the drawers and the feet their own models separate from the main body of the dresser. Just look at the difference in the texture map templates. One big template on the left for the dresser, and a few small templates on the right for the chair. Not to mention, there were a few parts of the chair that didn't need to be UV mapped at all, because they were separated from some of the details and I was able to just apply solid colors. So, needless to say, I'm going to keep these experiences in mind going forward whenever I'm modeling more complex objects. Aside from all these complications with the texture mapping, I also want to mention 2 complete game changers I encountered while working on this stuff. First one, which is real simple, is grid snapping in Blender. Since I'm doing everything in this low poly style with vertices aligned to the nearest centimeter, it was so helpful to set this up. I just had to set these guides in viewport overlays at scale 0.01 and then set the snapping to increment with absolute grid snap. Before I set this up, I was meticulously typing in measurements with the keyboard, making sure I didn't type in something that was like a fraction of a centimeter by accident, which would misalign everything, of course. At this point already, I think dealing with that sort of thing would be an absolute nightmare. The other thing was that I figured out how to use Blender 3's .blend files directly with Godot 4, like I mentioned I might be able to do in my last video. I did so by following this convenient video by Stay at Home Dev, which I've linked in the description for reference. Now I can have Godot and Blender open at the same time, and Godot will automatically re-import my blend files anytime I make changes or save over them in Blender. As far as I'm concerned, this means I don't have to do any more manual exports, at least when it comes to my environment models. The character model is a little more difficult to deal with, but I won't be changing it nearly as frequently as the environment, so this is fine. After these 2 revelations, the outlook on this project is looking quite a bit more plausible. Without further ado, let's take a look at some gameplay. So, you might be able to tell, but I've scaled down the character model a bit more and slowed down its run speed. I'll likely need to make him even smaller and slower to slow down the pace of the game in general, but also especially if I want to make more use of the space in my room and pack in more details. That can be fine-tuned once I have more things to jump around on and interact with. Speaking of interactivity, I've included some collision here to start testing the gameplay. If you add -col to the name of any mesh in your Blender file, Godot will automatically make a collision shape which lines up exactly with that mesh. As a result of using this shortcut, collision models are relatively complex and pretty buggy from my experience. I know in general you want to keep your collision models fairly simple and simpler than the actual rendered model usually. If the collision shapes are too complex, I think detecting collision can become a very expensive computation. While my collision models aren't that complex that I'm getting any slowdown, the bugginess is definitely an issue. You can see here I can jump right into the side of my dresser for some reason. I also get stuck on certain sides of the outer bedroom walls and just about any place where there's a few different collisions from a few different objects happening at the same time. I suspect there's an issue with the orientation of the collision faces, if that's possible. If I were to make these collision shapes more deliberately, perhaps I could get better results here. But I certainly need to do some research into this to correct the issue. Just another thing for me to look into going forward. And that's all I have for now. I really think one of the coolest things I can offer with this game, regardless of how the actual gameplay turns out, is the level of detail I'm putting into recreating my room in Blender. I can at least say that's where a lot of the value lies in this project for me personally, considering this is my room. And the fact that it's interactive at all is just a big plus for me. When I look at other small-scale games that try to simulate a space that's been lived in, I get the impression that they start by planning the gameplay and all the characters' interactions first, and then fill it with objects that make sense in the setting. But with regard to my game, I'm more inclined to stay authentic to the real-life source material as a starting point and work around that as I come up with more ideas. When I do start getting more into level design, I'm aiming for every single interactive element in my game to actually be a thing that I own and have in my room. I'm thinking this will make the setting feel more real and personal, despite the stylization of my graphics. Speaking of level design though, I did start putting some thought into how the gameplay will go. Upon the recommendation of one of my friends, I partook in a little method acting by getting on the floor and looking around at things from a lower perspective. As a result, I was able to better consider what might be fun for a small character to explore and navigate around. Here are some pictures I took after I repositioned some of the things in my room, so you can get a feel for what I'm talking about. So when the time comes, I at least have somewhat of a starting point now. I've certainly got my work cut out for me on both the modeling and the gameplay sides of this project now. That's all I've got for you this time, but as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. By the way, this is the part where you can like my video and subscribe to my channel, if you so please. Strangely, on my last video, I got more subscriptions than likes, so I don't know how that works, but I'm all for it. Anyway, I'm really tired, and I'd really like to go to bed, so I'll catch you later.